HOA Karen electrocuted my disabled daughter just to teach her how to follow rules. It was a sunny morning, a seemingly ordinary day, until the moment everything changed. The HOA meeting was starting, the usual faces filling the room, exchanging polite greetings, but nothing could have prepared me for the horror that was about to unfold. My daughter, Emma, sat beside me, her wheelchair positioned carefully so she could see the proceedings. Emma, sweet as sugarcane, had never been able to stand on her own. Her body, frail and fragile, was held together by the strength of her spirit, the strength that I fought so hard to nurture. But today, her spirit would be tested like never before. The HOA anthem began playing, a song that meant nothing to Emma, a song that she would never be able to physically participate in. I watched her struggle to look around, her small face filled with confusion and frustration. The rules were simple: stand up during the anthem. But for Emma, that simple act was impossible. It wasn't a choice, it was her body betraying her every time she tried to stand. Karen, the ever-vigilant HOA member known for her iron grip on rules, stood glaring across the room. She had always been strict, her gaze sharp, and her words even sharper. I could feel her eyes on Emma, waiting for the moment she'd slip up. And then it happened. Karen's voice rang out, loud and sharp. "Stand up," she demanded, as if Emma's disability was an excuse for disobedience. My heart stopped. There was no understanding, no empathy, just the cold, hard demand for compliance. Emma's hands gripped the armrests of her wheelchair, her lips trembling as she tried to push herself up. I could see the pain in her eyes, the effort it took to make even the slightest movement. She looked at me, her face pleading for help, but there was nothing I could do. "Stand up." Karen's voice cut through the room again, louder this time. My blood boiled, my entire body screaming in fury, but I stayed silent. I knew I had to pick my battles carefully until Karen crossed the line. Without warning, she stepped forward, the cold glint of an electric shock device in her hand. "You will learn how to follow the rules," she sneered, and before I could react, she pressed the button. The jolt of electricity shot through Emma's fragile body, and a scream erupted from her mouth. The sound was more than a cry of pain, it was a cry of injustice, of betrayal. My heart shattered as I watched Emma's body tremble, her limbs seizing under the shock. Time seemed to slow as I saw Emma, my beautiful daughter, in agony. The shock was not just physical, it was a violation of everything I had ever fought to protect. In that moment, I wasn't just a parent. I was a lioness, ready to fight for my cub, ready to tear down the walls of injustice that Karen had so casually built around her rules. "Karen," I yelled, my voice shaking with fury, "what have you done?" But Karen stood there, unrepentant, as if what she had done was justified. The room fell silent, but I could feel the eyes of every person in that room on me, on Emma. They had all seen it. They had all witnessed the cruelty. And I promised myself in that moment that I would not let this stand. No one, not Karen, not anyone, would get away with hurting my daughter. The room was heavy with tension, the silence pressing against my chest as I tried to process the nightmare that had just unfolded. I looked at Emma, her pale face still contorted in pain, her body shuddering as she recovered from the shock. Her eyes, though clouded with confusion, searched mine for reassurance. The small, innocent girl I had worked so hard to protect, to keep safe from a world that could be so cold, was now the victim of an injustice that shook me to my core. Emma was everything to me. She wasn't just my daughter, she was my reason for fighting, for holding on to hope despite the odds stacked against us. From the moment she was born, I knew our journey would be different. I could see the world through her eyes. Every day was a battle for her, but she fought with a resilience that was beyond her years. I had spent countless nights researching, learning, adapting, always searching for ways to make her life easier, more comfortable. But this was something I couldn't have prepared for. No amount of knowledge or research could have helped me defend her from the cruelty of a woman like Karen. Karen Thompson had always been a force to be reckoned with in our community. Tall, confident, and relentlessly strict, she had a reputation for upholding the rules with an iron fist. People in the neighborhood had always respected her for keeping the peace, for making sure everyone followed the guidelines set by the homeowners association. But behind her polite smile and polite demeanor, there was something darker, a need to control, to dominate, to enforce her vision of what was right on others. And today, she had crossed the line. I glanced around the room, noticing the uncomfortable glances of our neighbors. Some were clearly shocked, their faces pale with disbelief. Others, however, looked away, as though this was just another part of the HOA drama they had learned to ignore. The lack of action from the others stung worse than Karen's shocking display of power. Where were the voices of reason? Where were the people who were supposed to stand up for what was right? In that moment, I realized that this fight was not just mine, it was for everyone who had ever been silenced, overlooked, or mistreated. I took a deep breath and turned back to Emma. She had stopped shaking, her breathing still a little ragged. But her eyes had a spark of defiance in them. She wasn't going to let this define her. She was strong, stronger than anyone gave her credit for, and if there was one thing I knew for certain, it was that she would rise above this, and I would rise with her. I moved closer to her, gently placing my hand on her shoulder. "We're going to get through this, Emma," I whispered, my voice trembling with emotion. She nodded slowly, a small smile tugging at the corners of her lips. That smile, the one she always gave me when I needed reassurance, gave me the strength I needed to fight back. But this wasn't just about Emma anymore. It wasn't just about protecting her from the world. It was about standing up to the people who thought they could take advantage of others, who believed that their rules and their control were more important than human dignity and compassion. It was about showing the world that even the quietest, most vulnerable among us had a voice, and we would not be silenced. As I helped Emma regain her composure, I turned to face Karen. Her smug smile was gone now, replaced by an air of uncertainty. She had pushed too far, and she knew it. But there was no going back now. The damage had been done. The look in her eyes told me that she wasn't ready for the storm that was coming her way. The room was still silent, but I could feel the weight of the moment. The realization that this wasn't just another confrontation, it was a defining moment. I wasn't just fighting for my daughter anymore. I was fighting for every parent who had ever felt powerless, for every person who had ever been oppressed by the cold hands of authority, for every individual who had been silenced by fear. "I'm not going to let this go," I said, my voice steady, but filled with an intensity that I hadn't felt before. "This is not just about one rule being broken. This is about the way you treat people, the way you think you can control others. This is about respect, and you will respect my daughter." Karen opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. She had no defense, no justification for what she had done. Her actions spoke louder than anything she could say now. The room seemed to close in on her, the eyes of the neighbors piercing through her. For the first time, Karen was not the one in control. The power had shifted, and it felt intoxicating. But I wasn't done yet. Not by a long shot. Everyone in this room saw what happened. I continued, my voice gaining strength. "And everyone here has a choice to make. Will you stand by and let this happen again? Or will you stand with us, with Emma, and show that we will not tolerate this kind of cruelty?" The silence was deafening as I turned back to Emma, her eyes full of trust and hope. This was the moment I had been waiting for. The moment when I could finally protect my daughter, when I could finally stand up to the injustice that had plagued us for so long. But it was also the moment when I realized that the fight had only just begun. Karen might have thought she could teach Emma a lesson, but she had no idea what she was up against. Because now I was fighting for more than just my daughter's dignity. I was fighting for all of us, those who had been overlooked, those who had been silenced, and those who had been pushed to the edge. And no one, not Karen, not anyone, would stop me. The days following the incident were filled with a whirlwind of emotions, but the most overwhelming feeling was a deep, unshakable determination. Emma had been through so much in her young life, and this incident had only solidified my resolve. I couldn't let Karen's actions go unanswered, not for Emma, and certainly not for anyone else who had ever been victimized by the oppressive forces of people like her. The sense of injustice that clung to me like a second skin propelled me forward. This wasn't just about an act of cruelty anymore. This was a fight for dignity, for rights, and for accountability. As I sat by Emma's side in our living room, the weight of what had happened seemed to hover in the air. Emma's body was healing, but the emotional toll was something I knew would linger for much longer. The shock had left a permanent scar on her psyche. She had always been a resilient girl, but no one, especially not her, deserved to feel so powerless. "Mom, will she get away with it?" Emma asked one night, her voice barely above a whisper. Her question struck me hard. She wasn't asking if I would do something about it. She was asking if the world would. The innocent faith she had in the fairness of the world was shattered, and I knew I had to restore that belief, not just for her, but for myself, too. I needed to show her that this wasn't just something we would quietly accept. "We're going to make sure she doesn't get away with it," I replied, brushing Emma's hair away from her face. "I promise you that." The next step was obvious. I had to make a stand, not just in the HOA meeting, but in the community. I began talking to the neighbors. Many of them had witnessed Karen's actions but hadn't said anything. The silence was suffocating, as though everyone was afraid of what might happen if they spoke out. Some looked guilty, others were defensive, but all of them had one thing in common. They wanted the situation to go away as quickly as possible. No one wanted to stir the pot, no one wanted to be the one to challenge Karen. But I wasn't about to let that happen. I reached out to a few trusted friends, people I knew would support me in this cause. Together, we began gathering statements from the neighbors who had witnessed Karen's outburst. It wasn't easy. Many were hesitant, afraid that their involvement might make them targets of Karen's wrath. But after seeing Emma's vulnerability and the obvious cruelty of Karen's actions, more people came forward. Slowly but surely, I was piecing together the evidence I needed to take this matter to the HOA board. It wasn't just about getting Karen in trouble. It was about sending a message that bullying and cruelty would no longer be tolerated, that no one, no matter their position, could use their power to harm others without consequences. With each new statement, I felt the momentum building. My anger turned into something more constructive, resolve. Every day, I spent hours compiling evidence, organizing meetings, and preparing for the confrontation I knew was inevitable. The more I worked, the more I realized how systemic this problem was. Karen was just one cog in a larger machine of control and manipulation. She represented the harshness that many in positions of power felt justified in imposing on others, often without question. As the HOA meeting approached, I felt a mix of fear and excitement. I had never stood up to authority in such a public way before. But this wasn't just about me, it was about every person in that room who had been too scared to speak out, about every parent who had ever had to fight for their child's right to be seen, to be heard. The day of the meeting arrived, and my nerves were on edge. I had spent the entire morning reviewing my notes, double-checking every statement, every piece of evidence. I knew this would be the turning point, the moment when I could either sit back and let injustice slide or stand up and make a change. I arrived at the meeting early, standing outside the building, feeling the cool air bite at my skin. As I looked around, I saw Karen arriving, her usual smug expression in place. She didn't seem the least bit concerned. She had always been the one who controlled these meetings, the one who everyone listened to. But this time, she was in for a surprise. When the meeting started, Karen immediately took her usual position, seated at the front, where she held court with the other board members. I walked in with Emma by my side, a quiet but powerful symbol of everything I was fighting for. We took our seats, and I could feel Karen's eyes boring into the back of my head, her disdain palpable. I ignored her gaze, focused on the task at hand. The first few minutes of the meeting passed like any other, mundane discussions about neighborhood regulations and upcoming events. But I wasn't here for that. I was here to make sure that what had happened to Emma wasn't brushed aside. I stood up, and the room went quiet. "I have something important to say." I started, my voice steady but unwavering. I could feel the eyes of the room on me, some supportive, others skeptical. What happened to my daughter on the day of the last HOA meeting is unforgivable. Karen Thompson used her position to abuse and hurt my daughter, all because she didn't meet her standards. This isn't about rules, it's about cruelty. There was a pause in the room, a collective intake of breath. People began shifting uncomfortably in their seats. Karen's face reddened, but she didn't speak. I pressed on. "Emma is disabled. She can't stand like the rest of you. She's not any less of a person because of that." "But Karen," I turned to face her, "you decided that the rules were more important than her dignity, her humanity. And that's why we're here today, to make sure that no one else ever has to endure what we went through." I presented the statements, the evidence, and the testimonies of the neighbors who had come forward. One by one, I laid out the facts, and with each passing minute, Karen's smugness began to crack. The room grew tense, and Karen's usual confidence started to falter. She tried to interrupt once, but I wouldn't let her. This was my time to make the truth heard. "Karen Thompson," I said, my voice clear and resolute, "you cannot continue to hide behind your position. The time has come for you to face the consequences of your actions." The room was still, the air thick with anticipation. For the first time, Karen was on the defensive, and I knew the tide had turned. The moment hung in the air like a weight that no one could escape. The tension was palpable, and the collective breath of the room seemed to freeze as Karen sat there, red-faced and defenseless. I could see her squirming, trying to regain some semblance of control, but it was too late. The evidence was clear, the testimonies irrefutable. There was no way she could talk her way out of this. The mask she had worn for so long was finally slipping. I stood tall, not letting her get the best of me, not letting her silence my voice or erase the pain she had caused. Karen was no longer the commanding figure in the room. That position now belonged to me. I had spent years holding my tongue, standing by, and watching as people like her manipulated the system, used their power to keep the vulnerable in their place. But now, with Emma by my side, I wasn't going to stand for it anymore. "Karen," I said again, this time softer, but with a tone that carried the full weight of everything I had been holding in. "You've hurt my daughter. You've hurt me, and you've hurt this entire community by allowing your personal vendettas to take precedence over compassion, over understanding." She opened her mouth, perhaps to protest, but I raised a hand, cutting her off. "There's nothing left for you to say. We have everything we need to make this right, to ensure that no one else has to suffer at your hands." The room was silent, and for a long moment, it felt like time itself had stopped. I could feel the eyes of everyone in the room on me, some faces filled with guilt, others with defiance, and still others with disbelief. But no one dared speak. Everyone was waiting for the next move. The board members, all too familiar with Karen's iron-fisted rule, shifted uncomfortably in their seats. It was clear that some were already regretting their silence, their complicity in allowing this woman to terrorize the community. Finally, one of the board members, a quiet man who had remained neutral throughout the meeting, spoke up. "I think," he said cautiously, "we need to consider the severity of the situation here. This isn't just about a violation of HOA rules, it's about human decency. What happened to that girl, to Emma, is unacceptable." His words hung in the air, but they were a beacon of hope. Slowly, one by one, the other board members began to speak. Each one, hesitant at first, started voicing their concerns about Karen's actions. Some even began to share their own experiences with her authoritarian behavior, moments when they had been too afraid to speak out. It was like a dam had broken, and suddenly the floodgates of truth were wide open. I turned back to Emma, who was sitting quietly beside me. Her face was calm, her eyes wide with a mixture of confusion and hope. I couldn't help but smile at her. Despite everything she had gone through, Emma was resilient. She wasn't the broken little girl that Karen had tried to make her feel like. She was stronger than that, and I would make sure she knew that. Karen, however, was a different story. The proud woman who had once ruled with arrogance and a sense of entitlement was now a shell of her former self. Her face had lost its usual composure, her eyes darting nervously as the room turned against her. I could see the sweat forming on her brow, the twitch in her hand as she clenched it into a fist. She had lost control, and she knew it. "You think this is just about you and me, don't you?" I said, my voice sharp. "You think this is about your little rules, your little game of control, but it's bigger than that. This is about the kind of world we want to live in. A world where people can feel safe, where they can exist without fear of people like you who believe their rules are more important than someone's life." I paused, letting my words sink in. It felt cathartic, like a weight was being lifted off my shoulders with each sentence. For so long, I had lived in fear of the kind of people who believed they had the right to dictate others' lives, but here I was standing tall, fighting for the one person who meant everything to me, and the rest of the world could see it too. Karen finally opened her mouth to speak, her voice shaky. "You don't understand," she stammered. "I was just trying to teach her that rules matter." "That rules?" I cut her off, my anger flaring again. "You were punishing her for something she had no control over. You didn't care about the rules, you cared about making an example out of someone you deemed weak. Someone who couldn't defend themselves. That's not teaching, it's cruelty." Her face paled, and for a moment she looked like a child caught in the act. The fire that had once burned so brightly within her was gone, replaced by guilt and fear. She opened her mouth to argue, but this time no words came out. One by one, the other board members began to nod, some murmuring their agreement. The room, which had been divided and tense just moments before, was now united in its disdain for Karen's actions. Even those who had once been her supporters seemed to recognize the gravity of what had happened. The truth was too loud to ignore. Karen Thompson, the board president, finally spoke up, his voice firm and clear. "We have reviewed the evidence, and based on the severity of your actions, we cannot allow this behavior to continue. We are revoking your position within the HOA, effective immediately. Additionally, we will be recommending further investigation into your conduct. Your actions will not be tolerated." The words hit like a hammer, each one landing with the force of a judgment that could not be undone. Karen's face drained of color, her eyes wide with disbelief. She was no longer the powerful figure she had once been. She was just another person who had failed to uphold the values of fairness and justice. As Karen stood up to leave, she looked at me one last time. Her expression was a mixture of anger and humiliation, but I didn't feel sorry for her. This was the consequence of her own choices. This was the price she had to pay for underestimating the strength of a mother's love, the strength of someone who was willing to fight for what was right. As she walked out, I looked down at Emma, who was staring at the empty chair where Karen had just been sitting. Her face was calm, but I could see a flicker of relief in her eyes. She was free, and so was I. For the first time in a long time, I felt the weight of the world lift from my shoulders. This was just the beginning of our journey, but it was a victory that would echo far beyond this room, far beyond Karen's defeat. It was a victory for every person who had ever been made to feel small, every person who had been pushed to the margins, every person who had been hurt by those who thought they could wield power over others. And as I walked out of that room, with Emma's hand firmly in mine, I knew one thing for certain: we would never stop fighting. The days after the HOA meeting felt like a strange blend of relief and anticipation. The storm of the confrontation had passed, but its ripples were still felt. Emma and I went home, and though the pain and trauma of that day still lingered, there was a new sense of possibility in the air. We had taken the first step in reclaiming not only our dignity but our rights. But the battle wasn't over yet. What had happened to Karen, to me, to Emma, there were consequences that had yet to unfold, and I wasn't naive enough to think that her departure from the HOA would be the end of it. It was just the beginning. The phone calls started trickling in the next morning. Some were from people who had heard about the meeting and wanted to offer their support. Others were from neighbors who were still too scared to come forward but wanted to show their approval. But there was one call that stuck with me, one that sent a cold chill down my spine. It was from the HOA board president, the man who had finally stood up to Karen. His voice was somber, and the words that came from his mouth sent a wave of unease through me. "We've received word that Karen has filed a complaint with the local authorities," he said, his tone cautious. "She's claiming that you slandered her and that your accusations were false. She's threatening legal action." I froze. For a moment, the world around me seemed to blur. Karen wasn't done. Of course, she wouldn't let it go that easily. I had known this would happen, but hearing it come to life made it all the more real. "Legal action?" I repeated, my voice trembling despite my efforts to stay composed. What does she think she's going to do? How can she accuse me of slander when the whole HOA board witnessed what she did? Unfortunately, the board president continued, "Karen has friends in high places. She's been contacting some of the most influential members of the community, trying to paint you as the aggressor. It's going to be a messy fight, and she's not going to back down." A pit formed in my stomach as I listened. This was more than I had bargained for, more than I had anticipated when I made the decision to stand up to Karen. But the thing was, I wasn't afraid of her anymore. If anything, her actions had only solidified my resolve. "Thank you for telling me," I said, my voice a little steadier now. "But I won't let her intimidate me. I'll fight her every step of the way. For Emma, for me, for everyone who has ever been silenced by people like her." The call ended, and I sat in silence for a few minutes, letting the weight of the situation sink in. But then I turned to Emma, who was sitting quietly by the window, looking out at the street. She didn't say anything she didn't need to. Her silence was her way of showing support, her quiet strength that had been with me since that first moment we found ourselves in this fight. "Emma," I said softly, walking over to her and sitting beside her. "Karen's not giving up. She's going to try to make us the bad guys, but we're not going to back down. We're going to make sure she's held accountable no matter what it takes." Emma nodded, her face set with determination. "I know, Mom. We'll make sure she can't hurt anyone else." Her words brought a sense of peace to my heart. She was right. We were in this together. And no matter how many hurdles Karen threw our way, we would face them as a family. The road ahead was going to be difficult, but we had come this far. There's no turning back now. Over the next few weeks, the battle with Karen escalated. She had gone full force with her legal threats, dragging the local authorities into the mess, claiming that she had been unfairly vilified and that my accusations were baseless. She was playing dirty, calling in favors from people in high places, and trying to rally public opinion in her favor. But there was one thing she hadn't counted on. Our community was starting to see the truth. While Karen tried to paint me as the villain, word was getting out about what had really happened. More and more neighbors who had been too afraid to speak up before began to rally behind me. They reached out, telling their stories, offering to testify, if it came to that. The tide was turning. The more Karen pushed, the more people began to see through her mask of righteousness. But it wasn't just the neighbors. The media had caught wind of the story, and it wasn't long before the local news began to cover the situation. Interviews, articles, and social media posts began to shine a light on the injustice Emma and I had faced. I had feared the public eye, but now I understood the power it held. It was no longer just our fight. It was the fight of everyone who had ever been made to feel powerless by someone like Karen. We were becoming symbols, not of victimhood, but of resistance, of standing up and demanding better. But that didn't mean the fight was easy. Every day felt like a battle. Each new court filing, each new accusation from Karen, added more stress to our already overwhelming lives. Emma felt it too. She was still recovering from the trauma, still trying to find her way back to the confident, happy girl she had been before Karen's cruel actions. I did everything I could to shield her from the worst of it, but I knew she couldn't stay in a bubble forever. This was our reality now. We kept going, though. We met with lawyers, gathered more statements, and prepared for the inevitable court battle. With each step, I became more certain that this was bigger than just us. This was a fight for justice, for fairness, and for the safety of every vulnerable person out there. Karen's legal threats were nothing more than an attempt to intimidate us, but I had something far stronger than her threats, the truth. And the truth was that I was not going to let her get away with this. Not now, not ever. The only way forward was to keep pushing, to keep fighting, and to make sure that Karen's reign of fear ended here. As I sat next to Emma that night, watching the sun dip below the horizon, I whispered a promise to her. We're going to win this, sweetheart. We're going to make sure no one ever does to us what she did again. Emma's eyes shone with quiet resolve as she nodded. The battle was far from over, but for the first time since that horrific day, I felt like we were going to come out on top. And nothing at all, would stop us from fighting for what was right. The courtroom was filled with tension, a stark contrast to the quiet, peaceful atmosphere I had once hoped for in our neighborhood. Today, it wasn't just about the legal battle between Karen and me. It was a defining moment in the fight for justice, for the rights of those who were often overlooked or trampled by people like her. I could feel Emma's hand in mine, her steady grip offering a quiet comfort. She didn't have to say anything. I could feel her strength radiating through her. This wasn't just my fight anymore, it was hers, too. The case had dragged on for months, each day bringing new twists and turns. Karen's attempts to discredit us, to paint us as the aggressors, had been relentless. But with each passing day, the evidence had stacked up in our favor. More witnesses had come forward, more neighbors had spoken out about Karen's history of controlling behavior, and the truth had become undeniable. Karen's web of lies was starting to unravel, and there was no turning back for her now. As the judge took his seat, the room fell into a heavy silence. I sat straight in my chair, my eyes fixed on the front of the courtroom. My heart pounded in my chest, but I wasn't afraid. Not anymore. I had fought for this moment, fought for Emma, fought for every person who had ever been silenced or ignored. And now the world would see the truth. The judge called the session to order and began his deliberations. I felt the weight of the room's eyes on me, but I kept my focus on the proceedings. My lawyer spoke first, outlining the facts of the case and presenting the evidence we had gathered. He spoke of the shocking act Karen had committed, of her blatant disregard for Emma's disability, and her lack of empathy. He didn't sugarcoat anything, and I could feel every word he spoke cutting through the tension in the room. There was no mistaking it. Karen had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. When it was Karen's turn to speak, she tried her usual tactic, shifting the blame, deflecting, and weaving a narrative that portrayed her as the victim. But no one was buying it anymore. The court had seen the pattern, had heard the testimonies, and had witnessed the damage Karen had caused. There was no escaping it. The more she spoke, the more transparent her lies became. At last, the judge leaned forward, his eyes scanning the room before settling on Karen. His voice was calm but firm when he spoke. Karen Thompson, your actions were not only reckless but also cruel. You used your position to hurt someone who was vulnerable, to inflict harm on a child who could not defend herself. This court finds you responsible for the distress caused to Emma and her family. Your conduct was unacceptable, and it will not go unpunished. My heart skipped a beat as the judge continued, outlining the consequences Karen would face: a formal reprimand, a permanent ban from holding any position of authority in the HOA, and a financial penalty to cover the costs of Emma's medical treatments and emotional distress. But the most significant consequence was the public record of her actions. She would no longer be able to hide behind her reputation. The truth was out. As the judge's gavel struck, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. It was over. The fight had been long and exhausting, but in the end, justice had been served. I looked down at Emma, her face a mixture of exhaustion and triumph. She had endured so much, and yet here she was, still standing strong, her spirit unbroken. We had won. Walking out of the courtroom, Emma and I shared a quiet moment together. The weight of the ordeal had lifted, and for the first time in months, I could feel the air around us clear. It wasn't just the end of a legal battle, it was the end of a chapter in our lives where we had been forced to cower in fear of someone who thought they could control us. And it was the beginning of something better, a future where Emma could live without fear, where people would see her for her strength and resilience rather than her disability. As we stepped into the sunlight, I took a deep breath. The world felt different now, brighter, lighter. I had done what I set out to do. I had fought for Emma's dignity, for her right to be treated with kindness and respect. And I had won. Emma squeezed my hand, her smile warm and genuine. "We did it, Mom," she said softly. And in that moment, I realized that this victory was not just mine. It was ours. It was for everyone who had ever been told they didn't belong, everyone who had ever been told they weren't enough. Today, we had proven that the world could change, that we could make a difference. And as Emma and I walked forward, side by side, I knew that no matter what came next, we would face it together. No one could take away our strength. No one could take away our voice. We had found our power, and no one, least of all Karen, could ever take that from us again. As we close this chapter, I want to remind you all of one powerful truth. Standing up for what's right doesn't just change your life, it changes the world around you. What happened to Emma and me is not just a personal story. It's a call to action for everyone who's ever felt silenced, disregarded, or oppressed. It's a reminder that we all have the power to fight for what is just, no matter how small or vulnerable we may feel. So, I ask you to stand with us. Stand for the voiceless. Stand for those who can't defend themselves. If you've ever witnessed injustice, now is the time to speak up. If you've ever felt powerless, know that you are not alone. Together, we can build a world where cruelty is not tolerated, where kindness and respect rule. Join us in making sure that what happened to Emma and me doesn't happen to anyone else. Share our story, raise your voice, and never stop fighting for what's right. Subscribe to our channel for more updates on our journey and leave your thoughts in the comments. Let's create a community where strength, love, and justice always prevail. The fight for justice doesn't end here, it's just beginning. And we need you to be part of it.